Who would have believed a century ago that one day man and his machines would leave their mark on the surface of the moon? The Americans were the first in July 1969. The Stars and Stripes, specially stiffened for the occasion, flew in the airless lunar vacuum. 380,000 kilometers away, the world held its breath. Yet, as late as 1956, the British Astronomer Royal described the notion of space travel as utter bunk. A year later, this machine was to set in train a series of events that would prove him wrong. The first man-made satellite, Sputnik 1. The date, October the 4th, 1957. The place, Kazakhstan in Soviet Central Asia. The Russian space program was blasting off. A Vostok rocket powered its way through the clouds and into orbit. There it delivered the tiny unmanned Sputnik to circle the Earth every 90 minutes. A Soviet triumph. And 2 months later they did it again with a satellite 6 times as heavy, 500 kilograms, and a passenger, a dog named Laika. All this was a prelude, a build-up to putting the first man into orbit. Slowly and surely, an updated version of the Vostok launcher was prepared for the job. It had 33 engines, combining a thrust of 500,000 kilos. Test pilot Yuri Gagarin was the cosmonaut, but no one could tell how even he would survive this brave journey into space. Bon voyage from the mission chief, and Gagarin was on his way. April the 12th, 1961, and for the first time ever, man was escaping gravity to make a single orbit of the Earth. Yuri Gagarin was in space. A month later, the Americans answered back in the shapes of astronaut Alan Shepard and the rather modest Redstone rocket, tiny compared to Gagarin's Vostok. But its task was more modest too. Shepard was simply to make a suborbital hop into space and come back. His flight was to keep America's Mercury program on target, a desperate pursuit of the Russians. Alan Shepard, at 37, became the first American in space. By the following year, the Mercury mission had changed gear as well as rockets. This more powerful Atlas was to thrust astronaut John Glenn into 3 orbits of Earth, 11 months after Gagarin. Glenn took some pretty pictures and made a well-publicized splashdown, but the Americans were still far behind. Russia put a woman into space, Valentina Tereshchova. And by 1964, Soviet enthusiasm was such that on one mission, 3 cosmonauts were squeezed into this cabin. The scene was now set for another great Russian triumph, the first walk in space. It fell to this man, Alexei Leonov. Squeezing through an inflatable airlock, Leonov was to spend 10 minutes in the vacuum of space. Reflecting later on the experience, he said, "You don't even move a finger out there without thinking very, very carefully." That same year, 1965, an American also walked in space. Ed White, spurred by the Russian success, spent 21 minutes outside his Gemini craft. In just 20 months, there were 9 manned Gemini missions, all of them experiments in docking. Quite suddenly, the Americans had perfected the technique of Earth orbital rendezvous, like linking up with this Agena rocket. They'd finally overtaken the Russians and were ready to close on their ultimate target, the Moon. October 1968, and the great adventure was underway. A gigantic Saturn rocket, 7 times more powerful than Gagarin's, lifted off from Florida. This was Project Apollo, a $24 billion program designed to put man on the moon. 2.5 minutes from liftoff and the initial booster was jettisoned. Altitude 61 kilometers, and already Apollo had burnt up most of her fuel getting into orbit. Next to go was the connecting collar, and there, slowly receding, was the beautiful blue globe of Mother Earth. The early Apollo missions were proving flights for men and equipment. First in Earth orbit, and then more courageously out from the Earth and across real space towards the Moon. It was Christmas 1968 when the crew of Apollo 8 flew right round the Moon. In all, they made 8 orbits. But the first lander was Apollo 11. Its command module, Columbia, was to remain in lunar orbit. The descent vehicle, Eagle, was to make the actual touchdown. Inside, astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin, dropping into the unknown. But the surface was bumpier than expected. Armstrong had to take manual control. A flurry of dust, and a perfect touchdown. The Eagle had landed in the rocky Sea of Tranquility. As an American astronaut clambered cautiously down the ladder, mission control was ecstatic. Neil Armstrong had become the first man to walk on the Moon. And there was a footprint to prove it. Over the next 3 years, there were to be a further 5 Apollo landings, all increasingly sophisticated. In typical American fashion, it was no time before the arrival of moon buggy. But there was serious work too. Geological samples were collected. And in the process, the astronauts developed the lunar hop. Moon gravity is 1/6 that of the Earth, so it was a neat way to get around in their cumbersome suits. Kilo upon kilo of dust and rock were carted back to Earth for analysis. It was no different from anything we had on Earth. And despite all the efforts of the astronauts, scientists still don't know how the moon came about. They do know, however, that both water and oxygen could be produced from the lunar soil, so given the will, permanent, self-supporting moon bases should be no problem, even if one pioneer found it difficult to keep his feet. And so for home. Without a hitch, the lander cleared the surface. The last Apollo left the moon in December 1972 to reconnect with the command module still in orbit high above the barren lunar craters. Earth, by comparison, looked magnificent, a symphony of color, movement, and life. Returning astronauts marveled at their home, the blue planet with its wispy white clouds. But the heady days of Apollo are long gone. Nobody's been back to the moon. The money and the political motivation ran out. America had proved its point and got an astronaut there first, not that the Russians had admitted to a race in the first place. Man has launched himself in the ocean of the universe. His real voyage of exploration is yet to begin.